Hello and welcome to Unacademy. As part of Hindu analysis today, we will be discussing 6 important articles out of the Hindu newspaper. But before we begin, a very important announcement for you that the 24,999 offer is back, and this is the right time to take the subscription for your UPSC dream itself. So, if you ever considered us as part of your journey, this is the right time to join us at 24,999. It's a limited period offer, will end by the next 2 to 3 days. With this, let's look at the topics which we have to cover. An interesting set of you can say GS paper 3 and GS paper 2 related topics. One topic which is the USCIRF report, which is the religious freedom report. We'll deal with it in a separate video itself because it deserves a separate video. That is why I have not taken it here. So we have the first very interesting, the textile industry, why it's struggling, but it gives us a lot of data and interesting insight into this sector. Then this is quite invaluable because this talks about UK and India vis-a-vis climate change and the concept of one size fits all for climate change and climate mitigation. Then gig economy, gig worker, there is a report which is involved here, we will discuss that. Then these 2 articles related to the Nobel Prize in physics which has been given to machine learning and AI experts, Hopfield and Hinton. And last but not the least, we have successfully and officially eliminated an eye based disease in India, as the WHO says. So, we will discuss each of these in what we call as a structured manner, and these 2 are connected to one another. With this, let us start our discussion with the first topic, which is why is the textile industry struggling to perform better. This comes out of a text and context question, and there is a context to this article. Recently, the Union Minister of Textiles has argued that by 2030, the target is to make the textile and apparel sector a $350 billion sector with 3.5 crore jobs. However, looking at the performance of this sector right now, this would need a 10% annual growth rate, which seems quite unlikely looking at the larger picture. This is where there is a certain target which the government has pushed in, and we now need to analyze can they meet that target and what is the present state. This is important both for prelims, because in prelims now they are asking trend based questions, so that becomes important. And the second more important aspect is how do you take this sector out of this tailspin it is in. So, let us divide this whole topic into 3 parts. The first part will deal with what is the present state. What is the present state? We will also discuss the global position of India as a producer of textiles. India has always been known for its calicos and cotton. And last but not the least will be the aspects related to the problems and how do we come out of it, which is way forward. So, basically I have made this article into one whole mains answer in which the present situation, the problems which they are facing, plus the way forward we will discuss. Now, when we talk about our textile sector generally, it is considered to be a very important contributor to the global market, and our domestic market is mostly fed by our own production. So, as of right now, it is a 153 billion you can say sector, and out of that $110 billion is within a domestic business, meaning out of this $153 billion, 110 is generated in India only. That way is quite a big population, we use that advantage for our demand, and only close to 40 billion is coming from what we call as the export economy or the export share. Irrespective of that, India is the 3rd largest textile exporter globally and has a very substantial 5.4% share in the global market. Looking at China, looking at Vietnam, looking at the cheap cloth which is coming out of Southeast Asia and Bangladesh also, India holding 5.4% share in the global market is quite substantial, with the 3rd largest textile producer. If we talk about how it contributes to the Indian economy, it is the 2nd largest manufacturing capacity in the world, and 2.3% of the GDP is contributed by the manufacturing, specifically textile sector, and the gross value addition for manufacturing, 10% of it comes from the textile sector. So therefore, when we talk about textiles, it is a very important sector for India's export profile, for its internal GDP growth, GVA, and over and above that, how it is placed in the larger market. Now, we used to be the foremost and the most important cotton producer for the world. Then come the British, the industrialization, and the weavers lose their comparative advantage, which in turn led to India becoming a net importer of finished cloth. After independence, we have in a way tried to harness that potential which we had pre-British in that sense, and we have been able to make out a $153 billion business out of this whole sector. Now, if you look at the people who are involved in this, that is also a very substantial number, with close to 105 million people getting employment in this sector. Over and above that, 80% of all textiles are also produced by medium and small manufacturing units, MSMEs, and therefore it is something which has a lot of value for both employment and the GDP. And we have hotspots in which we produce the yarn, the spindles, the cotton cloth, and export it. We saw in 2021-2022 a boom with close to a growth of $443.4 billion in exports, and there was an uptick. But since then, there has been a problem which is emerging in this sector based on 4 to 5 metrics. Now, before I go into the second part of the discussion, this is something which you can use in a generic answer. I'll tell you what is the point of discussing this. All of these data, you can expect it in the prelims examination, use it in the mains examination as a way of saying that India is a textile hub. However, the second part of the discussion equally tells you what are the challenges which this sector faces. That is the question we expect in the examination, which is what are the challenges to this sector. And this will show you how export and it is a domestic oriented market and domestic oriented production, how it can get affected by headwinds in the global scenario. So, third largest textile exporter, second largest manufacturing capacity, 2.3% addition to GDP, further 10.6% of GVA, 105 million people employed, and 80% of all employment and what we call as the production capacity is based on the MSMEs, which in itself is quite encouraging. Now, globally, since 2022, there has been a major slump, and to quantify this slump, in 2024, close to 500 mills have closed in Tamil Nadu alone in the last 2 years, and there is a 40% drop in the knitwear sector production. This is where till 2021-2022 we see an uptick, and this is where the trend based question comes in. Please note this: if they say that there has been a steady growth in the textile manufacturing and export of India since the past decade or since the last 5 years, that is a wrong statement, because there was a good steady growth from 2018, 2017 to 2022, but since 2022 and peaking at 2024, there has been a major slump. So any question when it talks about, for example, we had an oil seeds question which came with regards to what is the trend in the export and production. There is a downward trend in this. So do understand, no word regards to steady, no word regards to linear, or no words regards to exponential growth will be the correct statement in prelims. This is why these type of topics become and articles become important. Now the question is why? Why has there been an downward trend in this sector? And this can be explained by 3 major issues which they are facing. Let's first visualize it and then we'll go into the points. The first is geopolitics or the geopolitical landscape. It would not be a misnomer or a myth to say that Ukraine, Russia, the Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Iran issue, further the what we call as the political, you can say, crisis, or the way Biden has responded in his administration, the US and the US-China tensions, further India-China tensions, further the Pakistan-India relationship is already problematic, but the renewal of it from time to time. But here what they want to refer to it is that Russia-Ukraine, the piracy which is happening in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and specifically off the coast of Somalia, plus the West Asian politics, all of it has created a lot of issues vis-a-vis not just demand but consumer behavior and the general headwinds. So, general headwinds, we already know that people have argued that there is a recessionary trend in the global market because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis creating an energy crisis, which in turn led to a recessionary trend in the European sector. Europe being a very important destination of our cloth itself, this is where there is a cascading effect of the geopolitical landscape. This is where the politics of the world is impacting the textile sector, and therefore there is a slump in the demand. Global demand and export demand has gone quite low in the past 1.5 years, and that is not a coincidence that way. The second is raw material costs have been going up both for cotton and for what are called as man-made fibers, MMF, which is man-made fibers. For example, viscose rayon and nylon, and these are polystyrenes, are what are called man-made fabrics, and then you have cotton. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, for man-made fibers, there has been stringent quality control which has been brought in, and with most of these what we call as manufacturing units being MSMEs, small and marginal and you can say medium enterprises, they are finding it difficult to keep the cost down in order to meet these quality control measures which are there within India itself. The second is, which has been the biggest hue and cry, that there is a 10% import duty on cotton as of right now, and with certain, you can say, ecological disasters, with certain flooding and drought like situations in Maharashtra and the black soil belt, in that sense there was a need to import cotton, and therefore 10% import duty on cotton, in which the government of India is trying to protect the producers, the farmers in India itself. This has also escalated the prices. Now, what is even more problematic is, together taken like this, what is happening is that India's comparative advantage, or India's advantage as the third largest producer and the second, you can say, second largest manufacturing capacity, and that 5.4% share which we hold, India's comparative advantage is in a way now fading away. So, price competitiveness has gone away because of the geopolitical landscape and because of the quality control and the cotton 10% import duty. A lot of people within the cotton sphere are saying that this 10% import duty on cotton should be removed because it is making our cotton more expensive vis-a-vis international prices, and the quality control measures which are there in MMF, that is needed. But the point is that geopolitical space as it is has killed the demand to some level. Along with that, production based price changes has led to prices to go up, and cloth is a very price sensitive market, is a very price sensitive market. Now, it would have been easy to say that these were the only problems which are there, but further what the article points out, the first challenge, please note these challenges, these are very important for the examination. Second would be the raw material cost. Third, which they are saying, is with talking about sustainability. You would have heard about this concept quite a lot nowadays. People see ads about this also, that our cloth is made in the most sustainable manner. Sustainability is a concept which has been introduced. It is a sham, more or less a sham, because all these big MNCs, all these big actors just talk about sustainability. They will talk about how much carbon was pushed in, how it is recycled carbon, this and that. You would have seen for a lot of brands talking about now having tags saying that it is good for the environment. All of that is just optics. It is not truly sustainable. It is just an optics of sustainability, that greenage of their process. But because with sustainability concepts coming through, the sustainability concept is now being pushed into production process. And India, if you have an MSME based, you can say, production capacity, they are not in that space to talk, in a way, calculate their carbon credits and calculate their carbon. So with more concern and a certain consumer behavior where we are falling into this trap of sustainability therein, so it should not be a trap. See, it's not that cotton production and the production of cloth should not be sustainable. It should not be impacting the environment. But what we have as a structure today is a West-centric model where they are doing what is called as the concept of shaming of the process of production of cotton in India. So do understand this, that sustainability in our process as it is there because our farmers' carbon footprint is very low. But the point is that cannot be accounted for. And therefore, the idea that sustainability should be brought into the procedure of or the production process, they don't have the capacity to do that. So that is also impacting the fact that in the world demand, there's a new trend towards sustainable cloth and what we call as vegan cloth. Now, this is even more expedited by the fact that you have e-commerce. Now, e-commerce is good. It is good for you and me because we get things on a discount and it links us with the producer. But with e-commerce comes in the concept of informalization and the margins reduce. And therefore, with very, very low margins, neither does the farmer nor the producer have any incentive to produce for the market if it is having very low margins in that regard. And that is where the e-commerce, you can say the giants or even the small players, they all are trying to reduce the prices on the cost of the producer. That is again not good because that creates a space in which the cotton producer and the manufacturer has no incentive to be in that sector. But the biggest change which this article points out is a consumer behavioral change. See, previously if you and me, and I come from that generation where if you needed to buy clothes, you would go to a local shop. Either your mother or your father or your family has been buying cloth from that person for a very long time. Brands really didn't matter. 90s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, brands didn't matter. It was about the quality of the cloth and the, you can say, relationship with the retailer, which was a single point retailer. Now there has been a behavioral change because of e-commerce and the way you can see the concepts of Zudio, these big players, for example, Tata entering into that, Reliance entering into that. Now you have what is called as hypermarkets and multi-brand markets. And people are now, because of the changing advertisement processes, a behavioral change, people want to buy what is called as branded cloth. Now what happens is that if an MSME was supplying to, for example, a small producer in Tamil Nadu, if that producer was producing at 100 rupees per meter and then it was going for manufacturing and you were getting a shirt for 500 rupees, the MSME producer had a very big margin there. Now if, for example, they are forced to, because the single point retailer is more or less dead, only even in rural sectors there is the rise of moving towards going to the city for buying things. If you have a very big actor, for example, you have Zudio, for example, you have Reliance Trends, or even a big bazaar doesn't exist now, but the point is even you have the Future Group or the Zudio brand or Reliance Trends or Max or Westside, whatever it may be, if they go and procure cloth, they will procure at bulk rate and at wholesale rate and a very less rate. So if the MSME was able to sell at 100 rupees per meter, now he will only be able to sell it at 50 rupees per meter. So his margin goes down and thereafter it is sold at a premium later, which is not transferred to the MSME. And this is where there is a whole behavioral, global landscape plus raw material issue. Looking at this, the argument is that there is no way this sector is going to go forward at the rate at which the union minister is expecting. So the point of this article is, how do we come out of this? We come out of it through three things. First is, we need investment. Investment in this sector, close to $100 billion of, so that there can be at least some form of you can say internal credit and money circulation, which creates impetus to produce. Second is, this 10% import duty on cotton has to go, because it is pushing the prices higher. And third, it is saying that labor cost in this is close to 10%. For labor cost to be rationalized, which is not a good thing, but you need better productivity, and for that you need technology. Therein, the MSMEs need to be incentivized, and the money should be invested in these MSMEs so that they can produce more at a lower cost. So the larger picture of this article tells you where India is placed in the larger context. Then it has identified 6 major issues: geopolitics, raw material, sustainability, the concept of e-commerce and consumer behavior, and the 10% import duty, and then tells us how to go forward. Use this as a very important base to write any answer for textile sector. Now, what type of question can come? The India or the Indian textile industry needs a scheme which can augment both the global and domestic demands. Comment. Augment means to bring together. This is where there is a need for intervention from the government of India. But to answer this question, why is there a need for this scheme, this article is going to be quite important for you. So I hope that you are going to use the information given here. Remember, data itself is not important, the trends are important. Then let's move to the second article. This one is a very interesting one. The context is quite interesting, which is, it is based on the fact that the last coal fired thermal power plant in UK, which is in Nottinghamshire, has been phased out and closed, and now there is a hue and cry across the world that we should replicate the UK model, an English model, not something new, brings a lot of nightmares for us that way, but the UK model of colonialism was not something good for India itself. But the idea is, UK's model should be taken into consideration, and the developing countries should at this point of time, in a way, should follow and in a way argue or try to follow the model of the British. And this is where the article in a way says that this argument makes no sense whatsoever. This argument makes no sense whatsoever because of the historical experience of Britain and India. So the argument is that people tend to say that the green path is available to all of us, we are not following it, and this is where the article tries to refute this model that country to country comparison and one size fits all concept in climate mitigation makes no sense whatsoever as per the data which is available right now. And this is where there is a very interesting concept. Now, if you go by the rhetoric that when did this process of the first coal fired power plant start, people would argue 2019, or would argue the Paris climate agreement being the impetus which in turn led to phasing out of fossil fuel based electricity production. But if you look at the process which happened in Britain, the reason why Britain has been phasing out the, you can say, thermal power plant, coal based power plants, is not because of the recent agreements, it is because of what happened in 1952. It is called the Great Smog of London of 1952. I have an image here of the Tower Bridge, which the argument was that at its peak, and it was peaking towards its coal production, but Britain being the foremost industrial power from 1780s onwards, this smog had, in a way, because of the upper air circulation, the coal based thermal power plants, the production and the factories in London itself, had led to very low visibility. And if we say it in our terms, this is any random given day in Delhi where you have 500, 300 or 400 PM 2.5 and 10 levels. But the idea was, in 1952 it was a very big concept that London, the most metropolitan city, is engulfed by the great smog, and this created the context in which the British started to phase out coal. So their fight against coal is very old, from 1952 itself, and it was a 1956 Clean Air Act which introduced the concept under which for the past 70 years, under different pressures but in their own capacity, they are phasing out. So let's be very honest, this is before the regime for climate change and the whole concept of climate, the Kyoto Protocol and that all comes through. It is much before, and something from domestically coming through. There's also a Cold War angle wherein, because most of the coal was imported from the Soviet Union and the natural gas, till today it comes from Russia in that regard, coming from the North Sea in 1965, during the Cold War period, the British wanted to reduce their dependence on coal so that they could reduce the dependence on the Eastern Bloc, and with depleting domestic reserves. But remember, Britain was at one given point of time in 1913, 30% of all coal which you will find across the world was British produced. Britain depleted its own coal reserves and then has actually phased it out. So 20 mines in the mid 1980s were, you can say, closed by Margaret Thatcher's government. But do understand one thing, it's a very long process. Started in 1952, 1956 they introduced their first act. Further, by the 1970s, 80s, they will peak, and then they will start to phase out thereafter. And the 1960s, it was Cold War politics which said. So it was the Great Smog of London. It needed only 1 year of smog in London to change their perception. Somehow we have still one of the most polluted cities in the world, and we have no real clear political will. It's not that the people don't want to change, no clear political will to change stubble burning and all, but that's a separate issue altogether. But the idea is, do understand one thing, Nottinghamshire, the coal power plant closing is not a day process. It's been 7 decades where they've been phasing it out in a way, in a systematic manner. But now people are saying, why can't India do what Britain did? Or why can't the developing countries follow the developed model? This is where the real problem starts. What the first part of this article tells us is that where does the impetus of change come in London? Now I am pivoting away from that concept and towards the concept that can we replicate the British model? And that is where the larger debate for developed versus developing, and the fact that why can't we go on the footpaths of, or the, you can say, the padchins of the developed countries. That is where it's an oxymoron. It is a paradoxical point, because if you look at the historical context, you will find even more bigger problematic aspects. So let's now start to decode the way this whole concept. So our premise was, see, 1952 to 1980s, it is believed that the UK coal industry peaked during the 1960s and 70s. This is the period in which they are phasing it out. The impetus comes from the concept of the Great Smog of London, and 1960s and 70s it peaks, the production peaks, and 1980s onwards they have been phasing it out, and now we are at the point that there is no coal thermal power plant in the UK. Now this is the context. Now the argument is this should be replicated, that this should be replicated, and India and China, and specifically India, can learn from this model. But the argument which this article gives, and in a way is also very well substantiated, is that India can't follow this model only, because it's a model based on a colonial past, and we still haven't peaked. So let's try to create this argument. See, if you look at Britain, Britain had a historical advantage. It is one of the, you can say, the foremost powers when it comes to industrial power. Britain, first phase of industrial revolution, then second phase France and Germany, thereafter US, Russia and Japan comes through. But Britain is the foremost industrial power. Now, the data which they quote is the present data, under which they say that India is the third largest carbon emitter at close to 2.9 gigatons of carbon. We, after the US and China, are the third largest carbon emitter. Now, they say that UK only produces 384 million tons of carbon, and therefore they have been able to substantially reduce their carbon emission. But the irony of the fact is, if I will go into per capita, which is if I divide this whole emission by the population, I get 2 tons per person in 2013 or in 2023, which is lower than the average of 4.6 tons for the world. And if I divide this from the UK population, I get 5.5 tons. Now, this is where you have to understand something, that this data is immaterial, because yes, India is a developing country, yes, India is emitting a lot of carbon, but per capita carbon consumption is still half of the world and lower than that vis-a-vis the UK. Now, in order to make this data a little bit more, you can say, perspective driven and more realistic, let's add the data of 1850 to 2024 Britain emissions, meaning let's take into account the historical emissions of Britain, and then this holier than thou argument that we are 384 million tons, let's think, does it actually make sense? And the data shows that they have added 10.4 billion tons of carbon in that given period. This is where the developed countries are not understanding one thing, which is it has to be common but differentiated responsibilities, because Britain was a colonial country, a country which benefited from colonialism and was the foremost industrial power. All emission which is in turn leading to global warming today is not done by China and India, because it is only after 1950s that they have started to actually produce at the capacity which they are producing at today. Even only 2-3 decades back, they are the historical polluters of the world, and therefore their responsibility becomes bigger, and obviously they should phase out carbon. But phasing out carbon was also not because of the historical responsibility of global warming. As I said, it was because they wanted to reduce their, you can say, dependence on the Soviet Union. They had their internal problems, they saw health issues being emerging, and therefore they had the luxury of time to do it. If I go into the coal industry in these two countries also, if I go into the coal industries, in Britain, the first coal powered power plant developed in 1882, and by 1913, 30% of all coal in the world market was actually coming from the coal from Britain. So this was Britain. Further 1950s, 60s, their production will peak and thereafter automatically start to fall, and it is after 1960s and 70s that they started to pursue new renewable energy. But what does this mean? that there was an upward trend starting from 1884. We will take it even further back. I take it from 1800s, and from there they had an upward trend. 1950s, 60s, when we got our independence or when we became a republic, they peaked, and from there they went down, and they're now looking for alternative fuels. The people who were employed at it was believed at any given point of time was not more than 4 lakh, which is rather 40 lakh, which is 40 lakh workers were involved in coal mining and coal related sectors, which is considered to be quite big. But if I look at India, and this is where this article becomes even more interesting, the first coal mine in India was Raniganj, developed by the British East India Company. Now you tell me, do I attribute the carbon emission related to Raniganj to the British or to India? In 1774, they started to exploit Raniganj itself. This coal was taken out in India and then taken to Britain for its industrial revolution. So how is that this can be attributed to India? And 1774, we did not get a coal based thermal power plant, we got a coal mine which was there for the raw material extraction and drain to the metropole. If we talk about the first coal powered plant, it was not even in British India, it was in a princely state. In 1920, the Hussain Sagar thermal power plant was developed, and this was developed in the princely state of Hyderabad for powering Hyderabad and Secunderabad, and this will keep on going till 1980s. The first proper, if you want to say a power plant which represents independent India, is 1956, the Trombay thermal power plant, and this was will become the mainstay from the Maharashtra Mumbai sector. Ironically, if I look at the average age of any thermal power plant in India, it is 12 years, average age 12 years, which tells us that they are still 2 to 3 decades away from actually losing their operational life or even operational what is called as the operationability, which is that can they be operated after a given point of time. 12 years is nothing for a thermal power plant. More than that, we still haven't peaked for our coal production or even the people who are involved. As of right now, we believe that close to 50 lakh you can say miners are involved in the mining processes. Most of them are also agricultural labor. In off season they go into the mines. But looking at this perspective, you can automatically understand things that when they peaked, we started production. So how can there be an expectation that India should also follow the path of the British? This article is important because it gives you an example of how global climate mitigation has to be case to case basis, and developed and developing is true. India was got its first proper thermal power plant when they peaked their production, and it is believed that we will be peaking our production in by you can say the next 20-25 years. 2030 40 is the zone which has been argued that in this period India will peak its coal production, and close to 1 million workers per month could get involved. Close to 12 to 13 million, which is close to a crore of migrant labor, informal sector together would be linked to coal based production sectors. As of right now, 2030-35 is our peak phase, and we right now have 70% electricity produced out of coal, which is 218 gigawatt, and the argument is that this will again further go up, and therefore if we choose the path which the British took, we will not even peak and we would have to taper our, you can say, production. But more than that, it will be a costly shift. India right now has its own coal. Any shift to the green energy, which we are doing also at a better rate than the British, would in turn lead to the tapering off of our development, making electricity cheap, more expensive, which would then in turn lead to our manufacturing and domestic consumption prices to go up. And therefore, the overall argument is, you cannot argue that India needs to follow what Britain is doing and phase out its coal power plants. Now you would think that how would UPSC ask a question? See, I'll show you the question and I'll tell you how to answer it through the given data. See, the one size fits all approach in mitigating climate change is fundamentally flawed. Comment. Now you can't answer this question with a good answer, a good, you can say, content, until and unless you know what I've said in the past 15 to 20 minutes. To answer this question, the best example you can now pick is Britain and India vis-a-vis coal manufacturing. And I'll give you the gist of this whole argument so that you don't have to go through everything again. See, the simple point is Britain has moved to new and renewable resources. Sure. People argue that that should be replicated by developing countries. But this is a fundamentally flawed concept. Why? Because if you look at the historical experience, this is basically a new emerging zone in history also, it's called environmental history. A lot of research is happening nowadays on environmental history, and this is very critical for the concept of climate mitigation because that tells you the real picture. If you look at the historical experience of Britain, firstly it is the biggest producer. Second, it started quite early in 1882, peaked in 1950 and then has moved towards renewable energy, and further even today its per capita, you can say, contribution to climate carbon, or you can say carbon emission, is still twice as much as India. India cannot be in a way compared. Firstly, country to country comparison makes no sense, but India cannot be expected to replicate this model because India's journey starts in 1956, 1920s, and we still haven't peaked. We will peak in 2030, 35, and then we may look towards a more sustainable path towards a non-fossil fuel based thermal power production. And therefore, India's capacity to produce and become a developed country is contingent on the fact that we also follow this model, but you are asking us to taper, or you can say surrogate, create a separate path at a higher cost with no real incentives. The green climate fund doesn't exist. The money which is there is only for namesake. $100 billion per year was expected in that. If India wants to shift to solar, if India wants to shift to nuclear, India needs to then in a way stop its coal based production from peaking and then push that money into a different sector, which only distorts our journey, which was already distorted by the same English who are the single-handed reason for the poverty in India in 1947, in 1950, and till today we see the, you can say, the imprints of that. The colonial exploitation which made Britain what it is. So let's be very honest, and that is the moral of the story here. Britain should not tell us, and at least these developed countries, all these colonial countries should not tell us how we should, you can say, trace our path of development, because you expanded, became what you are on the lives, on the sweat, on the money and on the blood of the colonial citizens and colonialism. And therefore Britain's phasing out of a thermal power plant is extremely good in the larger perspective, but it is because India gave that coal to Britain and because Britain had an alternative path and it peaked when India got independence. So therefore, a country to country comparison, remember this point, a country to country comparison makes no sense whatsoever. And second, more important is, there has to be a common and differentiated responsibility. This is the gist of the article, an interesting one, gives you a lot of data, but can be contextualized in this way. I hope you will be able to answer this question with a good introduction body. Use this for the examination. After this, we move to a report called the Fair Work India Rating 2024, Labour Standards in Platform Economy. It talks about how the workers in the gig economy still face a lot of issues. Now for you and me, the first question becomes, what is a gig economy? Who is a gig worker? Where does this concept of gig comes through? Now this word gig actually comes from America, where basically the idea was that as a musician you used to get gigs, which is small opportunities to either dance or perform. And the word gig economy means any service based economy or sector of the economy which is service based, which has flexible, temporary and freelance jobs. The word emerged in the 1900s when there was the concept of jazz musicians getting gigs. Then by 1990s, contractual labor became the stepping stone after the movement out of farming into the industrial sector, and thereafter contractual labor became the epitome of the gig economy. Gig economy means part of the whole economy, a sector which produces and is based on contractual informal labor, and informal labor is one who is a freelancer. He is linked to that sector, he does not have any benefits, and the quintessentially most important definition of a gig worker is who has no social security or safety net. And in India, there is a very substantial portion of and you meet a gig worker on a daily basis, either in Uber Ola, either in Swiggy Zomato or any other Dunzo, or through the urban company sector, or even the riders of Amazon, Flipkart if they are not employees. An individual who is employed transactionally on a reciprocal basis from time to time with a service based app, mostly it's app. The idea was that an online platforms brings in these contractors who are distributors and brings in the producer together. So Zomato and Swiggy would say that we are nothing but a facilitator. We bring in the riders and the restaurants together, and therefore the riders bring in the customers. That is where the concept is that the Zomato rider or the Swiggy rider is not a full term employee or a full employee of Zomato or Swiggy. He is a subcontractor or a contractor. He provides services to Zomato, and therefore Zomato's, you can say, the owner himself going on a bike and delivering food and a random person delivering food is very different. He is an employee of Zomato and he himself gets benefits. He gets the EPFO benefits, he gets medical insurance, he gets certain form of, you can say, safety nets in that regard, but the other rider doesn't. He is just considered, even if he meets with an accident, if he is met with an accident, during the process of giving the delivery to a person, the company has no liability as per the contract to even give the medical cost of that person. So the next time when you see a Zomato or Swiggy rider standing in that rain trying to deliver your food, and if tomorrow he falls ill and cannot work for the next 6 days, Zomato, Swiggy, urban company, any other online platform has no responsibility towards that worker. That is why the gig worker is the most vulnerable in that regard. And it is not that you don't have gig workers in the IT sector. There is a movement away from full employment towards freelancing work. When you go into freelancing work, you automatically become vulnerable because you have no safety net, no form of social security in that sense. And if you look at the sectorial thing, you can see 42% are actually in high skilled freelancing jobs. The delivery agents and the ride shares are only 4 or 8%. So the biggest is still in the biggest MNCs in that regard. So the biggest exploiters are actually not these Zomatos and Swiggis, but rather it is these big MNCs who have now moved out of the concept of having a full term employee because there's a cost of that labor to now then thereafter becoming a freelancer. And freelancing has now been pushed through influences also. It's not a good thing, because the more informal employment you get, the less you have experience which can be accounted for. You have no safety net. Tomorrow if you fall ill as a gig worker, nobody is there to help you. Nobody, even a standard small employee in a basic sector, if he's a full employee, he gets medical insurance. There's no medical insurance. And this is what this report actually talks about, which is the Fair Work India Ratings 2024. Labor standard. It assesses gig working platforms, 11 of them, against the following principles: fair play, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management and fair representation. And in India, Amazon, Big Basket, Blue Smart, Flipkart, Ola, Porter, Swiggy, Uber, Urban Company, Zepto and Zomato all were taken into this consideration. You can get out of 10 a certain amount of points. You can only get the second point if you have got the first point, meaning if in fair play you get 1 point, then it creates an additional criteria. In that you will get the next point. None of them have scored more than 6. The report also tells us one thing, that only Big Basket and Urban Company are the ones who have got the first point for fair play, where they are instituting a minimum wage policy guaranteeing at least some work on an hourly basis to their workers. However, they did not get the second point when it comes to a local living wage based standard, meaning a minimum wage which should be based on the locality in which they are. A person getting 10,000 in Agra and 10,000 in Delhi, very different lives. And this is where there is a lot of disparity in that regard. In fair conditions, you have other players who have given adequate safety gear and public safety training to their workers. But when it comes to aspects related to fair contract, fair representation and fair management, none of them actually get no real points. So you have to remember this, because this can come in the examination. And thereafter you also have to understand that the gig worker and the gig economy is the most vulnerable economy. This gave me an opportunity to discuss the static portion, and now over and above that we have discussed the concepts related to it and this report. The conclusion is that worker welfare is not the focus of this sector, but the whole sector is based on workers. And this is where this type of question comes to. The foundation of the gig economy is in its workers' welfare. Do you agree? You can give a very negative answer to this also, that will in turn be a very capitalistic thing to say that the worker is getting remunerated about what he is doing. That's a very MNC type argument, that workers' welfare is not the job of the private sector, of not the employer. He is a freelancer, so he can moonlight. But the argument is, and the irony of the story is, moonlighting is that you can work in 3 to 4 places. Irony of the story is, they are subcontractors or contractors, but they are bound to only give services to one. Except for Ola, Uber, where you would have seen your driver shifting from Ola to Uber from Blue Smart. In Zomato, Swiggy, again, switching is very difficult, but still people do it and find space. But the argument is, bare minimum social security is important for workers' dignity and workers' welfare, and that is something you have to say. Irrespective of whatever you write in this answer, can't say that workers are not entitled to or don't deserve any form of dignity. That is the minimum the worker expects from the service. And see, medical insurance is a bare minimum they should have. They are all day sitting on the motorbikes running against time. If they meet an accident and they are the only bread earner in their family, they have no one. They have literally no one to help. Even that is where we have this obsession with government jobs in India, where we believe that a government job at least gives job security and some social security. This is where we have to change our perception, come out of that capitalistic understanding in that sense. Okay, with this we move to the last 2 topics, easy, straightforward. These 2 articles are related to the Nobel Prize in Physics, which has been given to Professor John Hopfield and Geoffrey Hinton. Now this one, this is a editorial article and this one is the front page article. Why have they got the Nobel Prize in Physics? because they are the ones who created the initial foundational understanding of AI and machine learning, which is called ANN, artificial neural networks. Now, this is a very specialized term beyond UPSC that way, but see, it is based on the idea that you would have made this diagram for sure in your life when you were in your school. This is basically a neuron. You would have made something like this. This is neurons. You would have made something like this for sure. Somewhere or the other NCERT based. This is a neuron. Now, the idea of a neural network comes from this only. What happens is a neuron is a brain cell. Neurons, what they can do is they can connect with one another, they can seek one another, and information can go to and fro. So, the idea was for machine learning and AI to develop, you need a neural network. So, you need an input, you need hidden layers, and then you need an output. And the output should also be able to give an input, and therefore, the idea was that how neurons seek one another, the idea of associating gateways and you can say programming codes to one another leads to what is called as a neural network, wherein a different input can also get connected to this output, and therefore it becomes a web, and that web is like the way we have our brain, that's called artificial intelligence. So, the concept is that the machine learning foundational theoretical understanding was developed by Hopfield and Hinton, and that is why they have been given the Nobel Prize in Physics to actually produce this invention, which can be used in now every phone comes with an AI feature. That is only because of these two men. So, you have to remember the name of these two professors who have changed the landscape of what we call as computing in the world, and they should be and have been recognized for their contribution. Not something very fundamentally, you can't be expected to explain an ANN, which is artificial neural network, but I am telling you it is based on the concept of how a neuron works. The idea is multiple gateways coming together and are able to connect with another to create a neural network of information in which to and fro of information is possible. With this, we move to a good news, which is that India has eliminated, according to the WHO, what is called as trachoma. Trachoma is a bacterial infection of the eye, and it was a major public health issue in India. India is the third country in Southeast Asian region to get this milestone, and this brings to us the static portion, what is trachoma. And the idea is trachoma was a bacterial infection of what is called as the chlamydia bacterium, causes inflammation and thickening of the upper eyelid. Then what used to happen was that the eyelashes used to curl inside your eye, and it used to damage the cornea, and in turn used to lead to blindness. And that is where this was a major issue which was emerging in India, and we have been successfully able to, through awareness campaigns, through government interventions, and through public hygiene, have been able to in a way eliminate this. So, before I end this session, 3 to 4 very important concepts we discussed today. Please do understand one thing. First is the concept of textile industry. What is its contribution? What is its challenges? And what is the way forward? Do understand this, that there are 6 to 7 major irritants in this sector. The second one is the most interesting of the whole set, which is the Britain-India comparison and the concept of common but differentiated responsibility, but country to country comparison in carbon emission makes no sense. Thereafter, remember the AI and machine learning, you can say fathers in that regard, Hopfield and Hinton, who basically created the neural networks which are used today. Trachoma is now eliminated from India, and gig economy, gig worker and gig welfare. This has come previously in the examination also. The gig economy question has come in GS paper 3. Do understand that this can always recur, but workers welfare is always a very important issue with regards to governance and GS paper 3 generally. So, with this I would like to end the session. I will see you tomorrow, other set of issues. Take care. Bye bye.